link to our YouTube channel at the bottom. So if your connection cuts out and you want to recap and catch up on the session, you're welcome to do so via the recording. Today we are delighted to be joined by Rob Branch and Dr. Tanya Desai, and I'll introduce them shortly, just firstly to tell you a bit more about the session. So today we're looking at a survey of instructional design models, and Tanya and Rob will discuss various approaches to instructional design and how to decide on appropriate methods. Rob is a professor of learning, design, and technology at the University of Georgia and head of Department of Career and Information Studies. He's taught secondary school in Botswana as a Peace Corps volunteer and later joined the University of Botswana as a lecturer in the Technology and Education Department. Tanya is an assistant professor of instructional technology at the University of Wyoming with 15 years of instructional design and project management experience. Tanya's teaching and research focus is on design-based learning activities and the knowledge and skills acquired and reinforced through these opportunities, both face-to-face and in online classrooms. Okay. And I also would like to note that there are also part of the AECT, which is the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, of which Emerge Africa recently became an affiliate. So, and also please stay tuned to your Emerge Africa newsletters. We'll be sharing more information about how to become an AECT member. All right, so just info as well. If you see guest underpresenters over there, that is Rob. So who's going first, Rob or Tanya? I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, let me get started first by saying thank you so much, Nicola and Jacob, and all of you who are there. This is really a privilege to be with you, and I look forward to getting to know a little bit more about each of you, but I really want to get to the heart of the matter. So I would like to say actually not introduce, but just to say Tanya and I are partners in this, and I'm going to ask her to come on and give her own welcome. But I just got to tell you that this is a real privilege, and I look forward to this dialogue this morning, afternoon. Tanya?
Thank you, Rob. It is a pleasure to join everyone. I know that it is probably a lovely afternoon where many of you are. It is very dark and cold and windy here in Wyoming at 6 a.m., but I'm thrilled to be part of this webinar to talk about something that Rob and I both love, and that is instructional design. You'll notice that in the chat I've put the 4 objectives we have for today's webinar. I've also linked out to the welcome discussion where Tony was gracious to give us an initial answer to my prompt, which was, how do you define instructional design? And with that, Rob and I will just kind of go back and forth.
Exactly. So again, as you see our ideas, absolutely we'd like to talk about distinguishing some of the differences, but right off the bat, I would like to say that instructional design is a creative problem-solving process that has structure, but it's not the only approach to developing teaching and learning. Instructional design, at least true instructional design, responds to a specific context. So very carefully, I'd like to introduce the beginning of the discussion by saying instructional design is a process. The context, the situation, the needs of the students or the learners are what drive the process. And the reason why there's such a plethora of instructional design models is because of the variety of contexts in which you would apply this process. One of the things that Tanya and I talk about frequently is that while it's a process, there are some tenets, some characteristics, some strategies and things that really define instructional design. At some point, I'd also like to ask us to be cognizant of the notion that instruction does include both teaching and learning, and you cannot have both. You cannot have one without the other. Tanya?
Absolutely. I want to take a moment to come back to Tony's answer, and actually, I see that Tony has joined us. If he would like to add anything in the chat box. So the question I posed was just simply, how do we define instructional design? And I think Tony brings up a great point that instructional design as a concept can probably seem more complex, or at least different in other countries than it does here in the United States. And because we are a wonderfully international audience, I wanted to kind of highlight that. And I'm chuckling at the way Tony phrased this, and here's the way that he worded his response. When, at the same time, many of us outside the USA are more accustomed to the language of various learning design models, which put far more overt emphasis on the learning than the teaching. And I think that kind of gets at what Rob was starting to say. From this place, Tony has an allergic reaction to the term instructional design, because it seems to imply that it's all about the teaching for predetermined learning outcomes. And I want to pause there, because sometimes I feel like we do get trapped into that thought. And what does it mean to teach versus to learn? And Rob has been a wonderful mentor for me over the years and has some great philosophies on this. So I'd like to hand it back to him here.
Yeah. So let me add something and then take on more questions, because I can see in the chat box we're beginning to get to some of the main issues. So first off, teaching and learning, in my mind, is instruction. I want to be very clear here. Instructional design is a way to respond to student expectations. I use the term expectations because objectives, for some reason, has now negative connotations. Outcomes may mean one thing to one group and something else to another. So when we talk about instructional design, I am talking about what are the expectations you would have for the students after some period of time. What are the expectations that can be measured? If we are talking about expectations or goals, objectives, or what have you, if we're talking about things that we don't need to measure, or measuring them is unimportant, you may not need instructional design. Nay, let me be more bold. Use something other than instructional design. And one of the things that I think is a folly is that instructional design, at least the systematic design of teaching and learning materials, is quite powerful, and therefore people tend to want to use it for every teaching and learning situation. That is one of the things that we need to be very careful about as instructional designers. As instructional designers, we take the context that we're given, or in which we're expected to have teaching and learning space. I'll get back to that. We take that context and then we look at where the students are and where we'd like the students to be, and we move along a path to move students in cooperation with the students to where we've all agreed they'd like to be. Let me add one more thing about that. Notice I said where we have agreed to be. I think it is essential that we as teachers or educators understand that we first have to agree on what we're expecting after some period before we can even begin. That's why one of the most compelling tenets of instructional design is to start at the end and work backwards. If we all agree that at the end of the day, the student must be able to calculate the area of a triangle, if that's what we've agreed upon, then whatever method you use, at the end of the day, the measurement is, hey, can the student calculate the area of a triangle? There will be different strategies, different paths, different timing, different tools. But if it's a lack of knowledge and skill, and that's clearly measurable, then we can use instructional design. You can use instructional design for ill-structured programs also, but let me start there, and even maybe Tanya and I can address some of the comments that are being posted in the chat pane. But I wanted to make it very clear, hey, instructional design is a cooperative process, and the reason why it is very powerful is because it fosters creativity. It almost compels you. True instructional design compels you to work with different constituents, other people involved, the student, other teachers, and other aspects within the context. Let me pause. Already I think I've said too much. Tanya, feel free to add anything you want as I read some of the comments that are in the chat pane.
I actually want to come back to Nicola's comment and definition of sorts, where it really does highlight we have so many models of instructional design and perhaps definitions and approaches because of the variety of contexts. And then later I saw Gabriel made a similar, as IDs, we take the context we are given, and that is so true, because even when I spent 8 years as an instructional designer for a state agency for the state of Texas, working with individual program areas gave us a different context area. So I found that I would have to adapt what I was thinking, what I was saying, depending on if I was working with law enforcement to design training for them, or if I was working with our water wastewater treatment folks. So that context really comes into play. And when we talk about international context, what does that do to the conversation? How does that change the context?
So if you think about the context, and not to be too broad, but if you think about the different contexts, you think about the different approaches to developing instruction or teaching and learning. And thank you so much, Nicola, for reminding us about the importance of language and the language of our field. And I really mean our field, not different countries or continents. I think we all understand the concepts. Our field, we've done a fantastic job even from moving from a very militaristic language, the target audience, the objective. And I become sensitized, and I know we've become sensitized to that, and that's made it better, particularly for people who are being introduced to our field of instructional design. So yes, the language really is important. So let me try this on you, and I'll try to pull up a image of this in a second. But I noted in the chat, I said, so why instructional design? Why do we need instructional design? What's really what? You heard the purpose and whatever. Allow me to share this with you. Instructional design is responding to some kind of context. What's that context? I've this thought over the years. Let me say it this way. Allow me to put instructional design aside just for a moment here. Bear with me. So we as educators, teachers, professors, other folks involved with teaching learning process, what is the space in which we are involved most of the time? It's a learning space, but it's an intentional learning space. It's a space where we agree that there are several entities that are involved: the student, the teacher, of which I think is a very special relationship, the content or the knowledge structure, media, peers. This is all happening as we try to move towards some expectation, goal. And it's happening over time. I'm not talking about instructional design now. I'm just talking about the spaces in which we live every day, the spaces that allow us to come to such a webinar. This intentional learning space has each of those entities, student, learning, student, teacher, etc. Each of those are complex, and they're interacting with each one. Dyadic relationships, triadic relationships, multiple relationships. And those relationships increase the complexity exponentially. And then you say to a person, hey, I want you to come into that environment, and I want you to guide someone towards being able to construct an essay that could be sent to local government about the way water is delivered to the village. You ask someone within that context, I want you to work alongside students so that they can understand binomials to the point where they can be prepared to make calculations about how to move from the Earth to the moon. If I sound esoteric, it's because I'm intending to. I'm not just talking about ABCs. I'm talking about when we as educators are asked to help someone construct knowledge. That's complex. Pause. Soapbox aside. Now, what can we use to respond to that complexity? There's curriculum development, there are policies, there are many things that we can do. I submit to you, one of the most effective ways to respond to the complexities of intentional learning space is to have something equally complex that can respond to that learning space. Instructional design, when properly used, affords us the opportunity to respond to the complexities of intentional learning space where the student is the center. Maybe I need to pause so that I clarify some of the things I've said about that. Got to be some comments. You guys buying that? Learning space, intentional learning space is complex. I'll see if I can find it on my computer and either send it to Nicola to post or I'll try to post it myself. But there's a diagram. But the bottom line is there are many ways we can respond to that complexity. Instructional design, it's the law of requisite theory. Oh, it's even in the latest dialogues. One of the books that you'll see in the resources here. This book just came out last week, and it's a good book for you to start thinking about some of the dialogues, even debates in instructional design. Something to think about. I know some of you are typing. I'll wait a moment. Tanya, feel free to add anything or help clarify in case something came out unintended. Okay, Tanya will be back in a moment. Had a crash.
Sorry about that. Had a browser crash. I went to actually fast forward to that book for you, and my browser didn't like it.
So, and let's talk about unintended learning. One of the things I say in my classes all the time is that students learn before they come into my class, and students learn after they leave my class. If I'm lucky, they'll learn during my class. Well, they're going to learn something during my class. The question is, are they learning what they would like to learn? Are they learning what they need to learn? Are they learning what we've agreed that they will learn? And that can be challenging sometimes, but that's why I make the distinction between intentional learning and unintentional learning. Learning is omnipresent all the time. If you stop learning, you die. At some level, we're always learning. When we talk about teaching and learning, when we talk about instructional design, I'm asking us to let's talk about what does it mean when we agree that there is something that we're going to learn. And again, the reason why you have the plethora of instructional design models is because learning is very different for very different places.
Up to that end, do we kind of want to talk about in the survey of instructional design models how we break up the different models that are referenced?
Yeah.
And what is that?
Tanya, would you maybe lead us through that conversation if you don't mind?
Absolutely, and this is where I want to mention, at the beginning, Nicola talked about how AECT and eMERGE Africa are now related. We are now in the same family. That was a wonderful little quick signing ceremony we had at the last convention. But as you join AECT, the book that you see on screen, the 5th edition of the Survey of Instructional Design Models, will be available as a resource to you for free as a member. You can download the PDF, but we've also been able to get the link to make it available to you for participating in this webinar and to perhaps even help entice your involvement in ACT. So in the Survey of Instructional Design Models, we actually divide up a number of models that are often used by practicing instructional designers. And we classify them as either being classroom-oriented, product-oriented, or system-oriented. And I think that this really helps to get back at that context conversation. And what are we designing? What are we designing for? Are we trying to design for some sort of intentional classroom traditional learning space? Are we trying to design for a system or process or even a product, an output? And what does that mean for different organizations? Because perhaps you find yourself designing for individuals who are trying to take another step in their career, or perhaps you're designing instruction for how to use a particular software or product that is produced by an industry. And how does that change your context? How does that change what your learner is trying to get out of that intentional learning space? And I see some typing, so I want to take a pause here as well. And actually, I see a question that came up. At what stage do we agree? What are the students going to learn? The most important and often most overlooked phase of the process. Analysis.
Yes, Irene has an excellent question, and I know that there are some who are typing.
And Irene has a one, actually, I can't, so I felt when Nicola was reading the introductions, I was like, man, I didn't think to put any of my connections and work in Southern Africa. I often work with Dr. Tudelani Asino, who is at Oklahoma State University. Tudelani is from Namibia, and we have actually conducted a little bit of comparative research looking at primary school learners in Namibia and in the United States. Something that Tudelani and I have been focusing on, and I'm sure at some point in our lives we'll put this into a book, but that is, how do we include the learner in the design process? How do we let them design their own instruction? And what does that do to the context? What does that do to the model or the process that we're using to design instruction for them? They have to be a willing participant at the very least. But what happens when we let them design the learning? What happens when we take advantage of the constructivist and constructionist paradigms? And does it matter what they're learning, why they're learning, how old they are? Those are some questions that I pose to you.
And the neat thing is, each of those things somehow need to be in the recipe that we call instructional design. That's right. The entire process should be learner-centered. Yeah. Tanya raises a very good point about the models. One of the reasons we wrote this particular book is because many of us are aware of some basic strategies for instructional design, but when it came to a particular type of learning or type of knowledge that we had hoped that would be constructed by our learners, we needed some additional guidance. So we thought, as Tanya stated, the first thing was, so is this mainly for adults in an informal setting? Or is this for a corporation or business where they need to actually standardize some type of training? Are we talking about graduate education? And thus we created the taxonomy, of which, by the way, is currently being reviewed by a group of doctoral students.
I'd actually like to come back to that, Rob, because you illustrate that wonderful relationship of how can you help the learner be their own designer, and the license that you give to graduate students at the University of Georgia. So the fact that they're reviewing the taxonomy and giving their input, feedback, their thoughts, their experiences as they are all in various stages of design expertise and instructional design expertise. It really is a form of scaffolding, I think.
Yes, yes. And see, that's the neat thing about instructional design. It is really applying a variety of proven learning theories, proven theories that we know work. Scaffolding is one of them. In fact, one of the tenets, I believe, of instructional design is to help move the student from being dependent upon the teacher to independent of the teacher. So that at the beginning of a course or a session or a unit, you might have a lot more teacher involvement, but as you move through the course of time, as you get to the end, the student becomes independent of the teacher. I believe a good instructional design model will move the student from being teacher dependent to teacher independent.
And I think Julie just brought up an interesting point related to that. How does that look different in an online or distance setting versus a face-to-face localized setting? And I asked that in the context of, as soon as we're finished with this webinar, I get to dedicate about 4 or 5 hours to supporting the 2 online graduate courses that I teach.
So let's talk and talk about online now. Now, this is very interesting because online learning and the proliferation of online learning environments and even massive open online courses has enhanced the popularity of instructional design. And while I welcome any popularity in this field, I would ask us to be cautious that instructional design is, we avoid it being equated with how you develop courses online. Instructional design is a way to develop teaching and learning materials. The neat thing is, it is a process that is suitable for developing online learning. So in terms of using instructional design, or maybe a specific instructional design model for online learning, I'm a little hesitant to say there's a specific model, but I think that when you get to the part in instructional design where you talk about the delivery system, online learning environments must feature because they are different from face-to-face. In fact, one of the phenomena that is being observed around now in the last few months, when I speak with people who have discovered instructional design to put their courses online, what I've discovered is that they're saying, oh, because it's an online learning environment and I have to do so much preparation ahead of time, and I have to really think about the students, and I have to think about the diversity of the students and the culture of the atmosphere and so many variables, that I've spent a lot of time preparing, and I've got good materials for students who are advancing at different rates. I've got good materials for students who are doing this where they need to become their own teachers in some respect. And get this, I've actually heard professors say, oh, I'm going to bring some of these strategies from preparing my online courses back to my face-to-face lectures. That's the power of instructional design. Maybe one of you have had that experience where you're moving a class to an online environment, and because of how you have to pay attention to detail to create an online course and account for all the different variables that you sometimes feel like you can anticipate naturally, but you have to prepare them, that you are even using them to enhance your face-to-face courses. It really is almost a reversed thing. And by the way, the last thing we want to promote is just say, oh, just do what you do. Try to do what you do in the face-to-face classroom. Just kind of try to do that online. I think that we really need to take advantage of all the wonderful tools that are available to us. So let me lay that out there. I'm saying because of what we have to do when we are designing teaching and learning materials for online learning environments, the power of that can even be used back in the face-to-face classroom.
I actually want to add there's some conversations I've had with faculty here at the University of Wyoming that typically teach face-to-face courses. And when they're asked to convert a course for online delivery or teach one that's already been developed for online and they just have to take it over. In many other disciplines outside of education, I get the same reactions, and they often entail a reaction or response along the lines of, it's a lot more work to design for an online class than it is my face-to-face. At which point, I sometimes wonder, what aren't they doing for their face-to-face? I want to pause there to kind of mull that over and what that might mean.
That's exactly right, Nicola. Nicola's spot on. Mm-hmm. And one of the neat things, as again Nicola says, seemingly not as much effort with face-to-face, is because the physical presence of being able to sense or see or read faces, unconscious or otherwise, our expertise. Right now, look at us in this environment. There might be some lulls in the conversation, at least the audio part, but because of what we're accomplishing and allowing people to type and this environment, it has we're trying to do different things. However, when you are facing a group of people and you make a statement that, yes, the earth is round, and no, the sun does not revolve around us, you can see the expressions. So very quickly, you can do some things. You can adjust. In an online learning environment, particularly in an asynchronous online learning environment, I now have to anticipate what all those kinds of reactions or expressions might be. So, again, the purpose of this webinar is to have us think about instructional design in a variety of ways and to distinguish between the process of instructional design and specific needs. So it's the specific needs. And also to describe the different ways in which instruction is systematically designed. Let me hasten to add, as you will see in the Survey of Models book, the systematic approach, or systems theory based, is one of the most prevalent and probably the most popular, but there are other ways. As Nicole is putting up another slide, she's putting, or Tanya, they're putting up some information about Addie not being a model, because this, if I think that, I don't know if we have a larger one of this one. Hang on one second. I wanted to just show you very clearly. No, forgive me for just, yeah, it's not really. Remember I mentioned to you that one of the ways instructional design, whatever model that you have, thanks Nicola and Tanya, you notice the big T for teacher and the orange S or whatever color for student. So this is a concept, and if we need to talk more about specific models, we will. Merrill's 4C, Reiglu's even elaboration theory, but all of those, I would contend, you want to move over time from being teacher dependent to teacher independent. You want to do something else also. You want to move your students through learning space to performance space. See the smaller reddish square in the middle? And then you see the green area. That's intended to simulate performance space. A lot of our classes, online or otherwise, lectures in particular, stay here. We need to be very careful. The learners need to move and progress over the course of time, either in a single unit or a single lecture or over a course of study, to where the learning space, where you're guiding the student, becomes larger and larger and approximates the reality outside the classroom. So in your design of instruction, your strategies, your content, how do you get these things? This is why you need to involve learners in the development of your instruction, your teaching and learning. This is why you need to involve your colleagues. This is why you should almost always use a team approach, because the idea is you are trying to move the learner from a space to where you actually approximate the reality outside the classroom. So Addie's a paradigm, and we could talk more about this, but the one last thing I want to show you, or one more thing I want to show you, and unfortunately I don't need it as a separate one. So this is an introduction slide. Yeah. See that lower left-hand image, learning space? That's what I was talking about earlier. Take a look at that. Okay. Yeah, if we can make it bigger, that's fine. But yes, see that space there? That's what I was referring to earlier. That's not an instructional design model. It's not a teaching model. By the way, there is a major difference between instructional design models and instructional models, or teaching and learning, or learning design, of which we have to get back to that. Someone mentioned early on, there's a big difference between learning design. Different debate, different discussion. But instruction or teaching is very different than instruction. This, what you see in front of you, is merely one way that I try to conceive of the environment that I work. And what may be unclear is that each of these is complex among themselves, and they're interacting with other entities that are complex among themselves, and all of this is happening over time. This is what we can use instructional design to address. Let me pause. Take this learning space, this intentional learning space, of which I'm proud to say that I first started working on a variation of this back in 1995 at the University of Natal. I'm sorry, University of KwaZulu-Natal. It had a different time, but University of KwaZulu-Natal, there at a conference on learning space. And that's when I discovered student is the focal point. Now, that's not to say the student chooses the outcomes. What it's to say is that must be student participation, and me as a teacher, my professional development, my use of instructional design, my use of teaching strategies, I need to have the student in mind. Usually we're dealing with peers. It's all situated somewhere even the theory of situated cognition plays into this. Yes. Let me stop talking. Either feel free to voice your question or ask your question in the chat. And thank you, Tanya, for helping us get to this. But I just wanted to share with you the whole notion of learning space, teacher independence, and moving the student to where they can use what they learn in your classroom outside your classroom. Hey, I'll say one more thing. If this doesn't stimulate or provoke a question or a comment, I'll be surprised. If what you design and do in your classroom cannot be used by your students outside your classroom, then probably what you did in your classroom is worthless.
Definitely see some folks are typing. And I want to mention here, because authorless Addie has come up, I completely forgot, because my book has been borrowed, to put a cover in the resources PowerPoint of the Principles of Instructional Design book, which is one that I refer to quite often simply because it is one of my favorite co-authors who has not been with us for some time, but that is Bob Gagne. And I feel like it would be remiss to talk about instructional design without giving him some sort of nod. And that is precisely why he helped proliferate the ADDIE process through American military instructional design, which, as I was just speaking with my undergraduate students last week, we really saw that transition, and the lens on the impact of instructional design and how we might use it came about during World War II military training. Many, actually, if you look at any Air Force instructional video, you will find all the hallmarks of the ADDIE process, and you will find Bob Gagne's stamp all over those videos. And Nicola with my favorite response, ADDIE is not a model, it is a process.
And thanks, Tony. And thank you, Tanya. Yes, Robert Gagne. So isn't one of the limitations of a lot of intentional learning that much learned for compliance or passing exams and has no impact on deep assumptions or beliefs? Not ADDIE or the instructional design process, but people apply instructional design poorly or attempt to design teaching and learning and use the instructional design moniker. The practice is the problem, or shall I say the practice is the solution. True instructional designers will first identify the type of learning or the type of knowledge or whatever the expectations are. So I want to be very careful here. We, as designers of teaching and learning materials, determine what kinds of knowledge and skills we want constructed. Part of the problem is we often focus on the lower level types of learning, the lower level blooms, just knowledge and remembering, and I just need to teach them enough to pass a test. That's not the process. It's like a hammer. I can use a hammer to nail the nails and put together a house, or I can use a hammer to bash a window in a car. The hammer's not the fault. The process is not the fault. And to put the most positive spin on this that I can is that in the analysis, in the analysis, when you're doing this, it is essential that true instructional designers identify the type of learning. So I alluded to this earlier. Let me try and go back to it before I break out in song. If I had a hammer in the morning. So before I break out in song here, if the intention is to have our students, if the intention is to have our students, whoever they are, let's say they've got to be able to, I'm trying to pick something very mundane and it's very difficult, but if at the end of the day, the students need to be able to multiply fractions up to 2 places after the decimal, then okay, I can use instructional design. I can use some other things too. I can use instructional design, but that's a low-level type of learning. If at the end of the day, I want the students to be able to go out to a restaurant and calculate the tip that they're going to leave for the server. Hey, I can use instructional design for that also. The strategies may differ. If I want to use instructional design for teaching English or English composition or whatever, doesn't even have to be English, but composing a letter, doesn't make a difference, whatever the language is. I can teach grammar, but I can also say, hey, I don't want, this class is not about grammar. This class is about writing the different kinds of letters to maybe a local agent or local politician. I need to get some better examples, but the point I'm trying to address here is that the limitation is not in the process, it's in the application. Very good question. It depends on the Nicola's question. And that's the problem with the very static diagram. This thing really changes. Let me see. I don't think the slideshow has another one. It varies on the context because depending on the context, these shapes might be larger. For example, if I'm working with a group that I've worked with before and almost the student group remains unchanged, I might have a relatively small analyze circle. However, I'm at a point where I'm developing some new type of software or application that's different for everyone. Maybe the develop circle is larger. So the intent of that and their relative size. The size will fluctuate. In fact, I'm actually working on a dynamic model that can be animated for this. I hope you all understand what Nicola's question is. She's saying, hey, look at the size of these things. Even if you look at the paradigmatic expression here, the size will depend on the context. The shape will depend on the context. Yeah. But Tony, though, again, Tony's question, before we leave that, one of the biggest criticisms of instructional design, at least that I've heard over 25 years now, almost 30 years, is that, oh yeah, it's good for training people to do mindless activities to replace cogs and widgets. I lament over that. Ironically, you can use it very well for that approach, but you can also use it to teach people higher order thinking skills. The thing is, you have to establish that as your goal from the very beginning. And then your strategies, your approaches, your activities, and all the other parts that go along with the teaching have to be part of that. So yes, okay. Let's talk about, at least for a moment, the South African context, where over the last 20 years you've seen a dynamic change in the student demographics who are in our classrooms, who are in your classrooms. So let me say something very pointed here. The goals should remain unchanged. If the goal of the varsity student doing his or her first degree was to be able to select the appropriate pharmaceutical, because they're a pharmacy student, and for the right symptom or whatever, and I change the demographic of my students, do I change the expectation? No. Then what? Something's got to change, yes. The examples may be different. The enrichment opportunities may be different. The opportunities for prerequisites may be different. Preparation may be different. But to be very clear, if you start changing the goals, you risk other kinds of problems. Spend the energy. My recommendation, and maybe this is, I don't know how much this is instructional design, but in the instructional design process, make that design and develop section, increase that to where you take into account the skills of the demographics or the demographics. Bring in other people who've had experiences with that particular demographics, but please retain the objectives. There's a debate about how to meet the different African contexts, even around the world. Where in some other countries, I was in another African nation last year, and resources was the issue. Just getting a solid, reliable internet pipeline through was the issue. You've got creative. Good instructional design only by your creativity. Well, what do you think about that? In fact, in the States, I'll bring it home to the States. I had a teacher tell me one time, this is many years ago, and I don't know how much longer I'll be able to use this because I hope it's changed now, this example, but I had a teacher tell me one time, because, we've got some folks in rural America and urban America where the demographics are making it such that we have so-called unprepared people coming in our classrooms. I think you get the picture. Here's the example. The person said to me, well, they're coming from broken homes and they really haven't been prepared, and they're going to be able to calculate the area of a triangle. If they could just recognize a triangle. So if I can just get them to recognize it, then I'll pass them along. That is a crime. That is a travesty. That is immoral. Instructional design is a process that is powerful enough to where we can find models to even help prepare our students. What's the answer? No. They ought to be able to also calculate the area of a triangle. But at the same time, maybe their readiness has a different path. So we need to use our instructional design models. We need to use our creativity. We need to use our philosophical approaches such as constructionism, as Tanya said, and constructivism. We need to use those to say, hey, how can I locate where this student is and get them to where they are ready so that at the end of the day, they can satisfy the expectations, they can complete the goals, they can create the same outcomes, they can contribute to our societies, and instructional design has then become a tool in our education process to help students acquire what we expect them to acquire. As I said it earlier on, but this is where the learners can even participate. Find a way to ascertain what the learners already know. Good instructional design is limited only by your creativity. I feel like I've said more philosophical things here. Tanya, help me out. Help me talk about what we were supposed to talk about, the future implications of instructional design and some of the other things. Because there's a lot to be said about it, but even the questions that I've seen and the comments that I'm seeing here, I think they're worth mentioning that instructional design is a good process, but maybe I'm missing a point, Tanya, that we've talked about in the past.
Actually, when you made your statement, Nicola typed it in the chat here, and I immediately tweeted it because I love that statement. It's just your creativity as an instructional designer. We need to be the ones who know how to dip into the toolbox, if you will, and identify the strategies that will help our learner, that will meet the needs of our stakeholders. When I was working for the Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service, we decided to standardize instructional design across the agency. And I remember the pushback that we received from our program managers, from the few instructional designers we had on staff, and we hired more at that point. But the pushback was we were trying to lock down and control what our program managers were going to be offering, and we were going to lock down and control what our instructors could do in the classroom, when nothing could be further from the. We just wanted to make sure that there was some sort of process applied, some quality check, if you will, that each of our programs were putting the same amount of effort and work into their instructional design process, and to force us to do our analysis, to force us to decide what should be included versus what was extraneous, because we talk about that nice to know versus need to know, and the interestingness details that we tend to add in. Those are often stories that come from the instructor. We don't lock that down in the instructional design process. Instead, the instructional designer should be working to facilitate and identify what needs to happen in this context and how can we make it happen. Because how I teach copyright in the United States looks different than how I might teach copyright in another country, especially in the Middle East, or if I'm in Japan. And that's something I love about being a university faculty member. We do have international students who take our classes from their home countries. My favorite conversations are when we talk about something that is very contextual. And what does it mean to violate copyright in the US versus not violating copyright in Saudi Arabia? So I think our parting question that Rob and I really want to hammer home, and this is a great plug for the discussion forum on the eMERGE Africa website. What is the future of instructional design? Where do we go from here? That is a great question, Tony. Rob, do you question the difference between good instructional design and learning design?
I'll take an initial stab at it, and being sense of time and making sure we answer other questions. Right now, I would say it is almost semantics only. I don't know that you can design learning. Learning is a very covert, idiosyncratic activity. As much as we know about the psychology of learning, I challenge anyone who claims he or she really knows what's happening inside our minds. I'm avoiding any philosophical debate about that. But what I will say is that instructional design, and if we could, if it rather than instruction, because instruction seems didactic, etc., then fine. That's okay. Yeah, Tony. At this point, I'd have to think about that some more. I'd want to preserve the term instructional design and work on helping people understand that instruction, in this sense, is inclusive of both teaching and learning. So I'd also like to say in closing, I think, as I mentioned, one of the major takeaways that I hope you get is that Instructional design is a way to respond to the complexities of a particular context, learning context. So with that, I would say if you get a chance, take a look at the law of requisite variety. It's you need a complex entity equally complex to address any particular situation. So I'll just say this, and I'd like to give Tanya the last word, or Nicola, but as we've tried to talk about, maybe we were a bit ambitious with our 4 goals, but we did touch on quite a few things, and I know that we'll continue the discussion. But ADDIE is one way to think about instructional design. There are many ways to think about it. The book of the models is another way to get us to think about multiple ways to approach the teaching learning situation. Tanya?
That's all I have. I know that we are at time, so I will let Nicola wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Rob, for that very, very thought-provoking discussion. Totally, it was so amazing. And I think so how folks will be able to access the book is by becoming AECT members, and I think we're also going to be sending out a portion of it, I think perhaps the introduction, to folks who attended the webinar. I'll double check that with Jacob. Yeah, but I think what I really got from today was that no is set in stone, and that we've got to be
thank you so much,
cautious about how we work with models, and how we apply these in our context. So thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
Just a quick reminder to folks that the discussion is going to continue in the America Forum. Okay. So let's debate the future of instructional design. Okay. Bye all. Thanks again, Rob and Tanya. Have a great day, everyone.